I can't keep doing this anymore. You deserve to know the whole truth.
The evening felt perfectly ordinary, the kind of night that slips quietly into memory without asking for attention. Outside the apartment window, the city shimmered beneath rows of golden streetlights as light rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the warm glow from a single pendant lamp filled the small dining room, where Emily had carefully set the table with homemade pasta, fresh bread, and 2 glasses of sparkling water. Soft jazz played in the background, blending with the distant sounds of traffic below. Ryan smiled as he took another bite. "This is amazing," he said. "You always know how to make a place feel like home." Emily laughed, relieved after another long week at work. "I'll take that as a compliment." For a while they talked about ordinary things, co-workers, weekend plans, and a movie they wanted to watch. Everything felt comfortable, familiar, safe. Then Ryan casually looked down at his plate and sighed. "My mom said something today." Emily looked up. What was it? He hesitated for only a second before shrugging. "She thinks I could do better." Silence settled over the room. "Before we continue, imagine hearing those words from the person you love most. What would you do? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy powerful emotional stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories every week." Ryan gave a nervous laugh, waving his hand as if brushing away an insignificant comment. "You know how she is. She doesn't really mean anything by it." But Emily couldn't hear the rest of his sentence. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the music. The warmth that had filled the apartment moments earlier disappeared, replaced by a cold weight pressing against her chest. She searched Ryan's face, waiting for him to smile and say he had defended her, that he had told his mother she was wrong. He didn't. Instead, he reached for his glass and quietly took another sip. Emily forced a small smile that never reached her eyes. In that fragile silence, a painful question began to grow inside her. One that would change everything they had built together and force her to look back at every moment of their relationship through an entirely different lens. As Emily sat in silence, Ryan's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. Almost without realizing it, her thoughts drifted backward, to a much happier time, when everything between them had felt effortless. They had met 2 years earlier at a neighborhood charity fundraiser held in a lively downtown park. Colorful tents lined the walking paths, local musicians played cheerful acoustic songs, and families wandered beneath towering oak trees while children laughed nearby. Emily had been volunteering at a book donation booth when a gust of wind scattered a stack of novels across the grass. Before she could chase them down, a stranger knelt beside her, gathering each book with a grin. "I think these books are trying to escape," he joked. Emily laughed, accepting the last novel from his hand. "Then it's a good thing you caught them." That stranger was Ryan. Their first conversation lasted nearly an hour, stretching from favorite books to childhood memories and dreams for the future. Before leaving, Ryan asked if he could take her out for coffee. Emily said yes without hesitation. From that day on, their relationship blossomed naturally. They explored hidden cafes tucked between brick buildings, spent quiet Sunday mornings strolling through the city's botanical gardens, and watched sunsets from the overlook above the river, where the skyline glowed in shades of gold and crimson. Their friends often teased them for finishing each other's sentences and laughing at jokes no one else understood. Late one evening, while sitting on a rooftop beneath a sky full of stars, Ryan gently squeezed Emily's hand. "I don't just want someone to love," he whispered. "I want someone to build a life with." Emily smiled, believing every word. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with shared dreams, quiet mornings, and unconditional support. Looking back now, those beautiful memories still felt real, but so did the uneasy moments she had chosen to ignore, especially whenever Ryan's family entered the picture. At first, Emily convinced herself she was imagining it. After all, not every future mother-in-law was warm and affectionate from the beginning. She told herself that acceptance simply took time. Ryan's parents lived in a beautiful suburban neighborhood where tree-lined streets and perfectly trimmed gardens gave every home a picture-perfect appearance. On Sunday evenings, they often gathered around a polished oak dining table for family dinners. The house smelled of roasted herbs and fresh bread. Yet despite its inviting atmosphere, Emily always felt strangely out of place. Ryan's mother greeted her with polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Emily," she would say sweetly, "you look comfortable today." The words sounded harmless, but something about her tone always left a sting. As dinner conversations unfolded, the comparisons quietly began. Ryan dated a medical student once, his mother mentioned while passing the vegetables. She was so ambitious. Another evening, she smiled across the table and added, "I always imagined Ryan with someone who traveled more. Someone from a similar background." Emily lowered her eyes to her plate, pretending to focus on cutting her food while every sentence chipped away at her confidence. Driving home afterward, Ryan would sigh and squeeze her hand. "You know Mom doesn't mean anything by it." Emily forced a smile. Maybe. But deep inside, she wished he had said something at the table instead of waiting until they were alone. The pattern repeated for months. Birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, casual visits that somehow always ended with another subtle remark wrapped in perfect manners. None of the comments were cruel enough to confront directly, yet together they formed an invisible wall, reminding Emily that no matter how kind, loyal, or devoted she was, she would never quite be enough in his mother's eyes. Looking back, she finally understood those moments had been quiet warnings. Warnings she had ignored because she believed Ryan's love would always be stronger than his mother's opinion. Soon, she would discover just how wrong she had been. That night, the apartment felt unusually quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets outside glistening beneath rows of amber streetlights. Cars passed below with a soft hiss against the wet pavement, but inside, the silence between Emily and Ryan was almost unbearable. Emily stood by the living room window, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had replayed his mother's words, and his reaction, over and over until there was only one question left to ask. Without turning around, she spoke softly. "Ryan, do you agree with her?" The room froze. Ryan looked up from the couch, clearly caught off guard. "What?" She finally faced him, her eyes searching his. "Do you believe you could do better than me?" For several long seconds, he didn't answer. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at the floor, as though carefully choosing words that wouldn't start another argument. "It's not like that," he said quietly. "My mom just wants what's best for me." Emily felt her heart sink. So that's not a no. Ryan stood and took a hesitant step toward her. "Emily, listen, she's old-fashioned. She has certain expectations. She thinks about things like careers, family backgrounds, and social circles. She's just trying to look out for me." "And what about you?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Who's looking out for us?" Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That single moment of hesitation was louder than any explanation he could have given. Emily realized she wasn't fighting against one opinion. She was fighting for a place in a future that the man she loved wasn't willing to protect. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She gave Ryan one last, heartbreaking look before quietly walking toward the bedroom. Behind her, he whispered her name, believing there would still be time to fix everything. He didn't know that, in Emily's heart, something precious had already broken beyond repair, and before the next sunrise, she would make a decision that neither of them could ever take back. The apartment remained silent long after the conversation ended. Ryan had eventually fallen asleep on the living room couch, exhausted from emotions he still believed could be sorted out in the morning. Emily, however, knew morning would change everything. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 2:43 a.m. as she quietly opened the closet. She folded her clothes with careful hands, placing them into a single suitcase without rushing. Every familiar object seemed to carry a memory. The sweater Ryan had given her on their first Christmas, the framed photograph from their weekend by the lake, the coffee mug they jokingly argued over every morning. One by one, she packed only what truly belonged to her, leaving behind everything that represented the life she had imagined. She paused for a moment, holding the framed photo in both hands. A faint smile crossed her face before it disappeared. "Some memories are meant to stay where they were made," she whispered to herself. She placed the photograph gently back on the shelf. Just before dawn, the first pale shades of blue began to soften the night sky beyond the apartment windows. The city was still waking. Delivery trucks rumbled through nearly empty streets, and distant birds welcomed the approaching sunrise. Emily wheeled her suitcase into the kitchen. She removed the apartment key from her ring, and carefully placed it on the wooden counter beside a neatly folded note. It contained only 4 words. Take care of yourself. No acquiescastions. No despretexplanations. No final argument. She quietly opened the front door and glanced back one last time at the place that had once felt like home. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they never fell. With one slow breath, she stepped into the cool morning air, gently closing the door behind her. As the elevator carried her toward the lobby, and the first light of dawn spread across the city skyline, Emily wasn't running away from love. For the first time in a long while, she was walking toward herself. And although the road ahead was uncertain, it was finally hers to choose. The first few weeks were the hardest. Emily rented a modest 1-bedroom apartment on the quieter side of the city, tucked between a neighborhood bakery and a small flower shop. It wasn't luxurious. The walls were plain, the furniture was second-hand, and the windows overlooked a narrow street where cyclists passed each morning with coffee in hand. But for the first time in months, the silence inside her home felt peaceful instead of painful. Some mornings she still reached for her phone, tempted to check if Ryan had called. Each time, she stopped herself, set the phone back down, and opened the curtains instead, letting the warm morning sunlight fill the room. Healing wasn't dramatic. It happened in tiny, almost invisible moments. She accepted extra projects at work, surprising even herself with how capable she was under pressure. Her coworkers noticed the change. "You've really stepped up lately," her manager said after a successful presentation. Emily smiled. "I'm finally learning what I'm capable of." On weekends, she reconnected with friends she had unintentionally drifted away from during her relationship. They wandered through bustling weekend markets, shared long conversations in cozy cafes, and laughed until tears filled their eyes over stories from years before. One afternoon, while walking through the city's botanical garden, her closest friend gently asked, "Do you miss him?" Emily looked across the quiet pond where sunlight danced across the water. "I miss who I believed he was," she admitted. "But I don't miss feeling like I had to earn someone's acceptance." Those words surprised even her. With each passing day, the woman who had quietly walked away before sunrise became stronger. She no longer measured her worth through someone else's approval. She was building a life defined by her own choices, her own dreams, and her own peace. Far away, however, someone was beginning to realize that the silence Emily left behind wasn't temporary. Ryan finally understood that she wasn't coming back, and regret was about to become a far heavier burden than he had ever imagined. Ryan never imagined that silence could be so loud. The apartment that had once been filled with Emily's laughter now felt painfully empty. Her favorite coffee mug still sat untouched on the kitchen shelf, and the small potted fern she had placed beside the living room window leaned toward the sunlight, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Every corner reminded him of the life they had built together, and the future he had carelessly allowed to slip away. The morning after Emily left, he had found the apartment key resting on the counter beside her short note. "Take care of yourself." 4 simple words. No anger. No blame. Just a goodbye that needed no explanation. At first, Ryan convinced himself she simply needed time. He called once, then twice, then a dozen times. Every call went unanswered. Days turned into weeks as his phone filled with messages he wished he had said much sooner. Asterisk, "Emily, please call me. We need to talk." Asterisk. Asterisk, "I should have defended you." Asterisk. Asterisk, "I kept telling myself Mom didn't mean it, but I was wrong." Asterisk. Asterisk, "I failed you, and I'm so sorry." Asterisk. Late one evening, he sat alone on a park bench overlooking the river where they had once watched the sunset together. The city lights shimmered across the water, but the view that had once brought him peace now only reflected his loneliness. For the first time, he stopped blaming circumstances and faced the truth. It hadn't been his mother's opinion that ended their relationship. It had been his silence. He had expected Emily to keep fighting for a place in his life while he stood quietly between the two women who mattered most to him. Instead, she had chosen herself. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. As autumn leaves drifted across the empty path, Ryan understood that apologies could acknowledge the past, but they could never guarantee a second chance. Even so, fate wasn't quite finished with their story. Months later, an unexpected meeting would place them face to face once again. Nearly 6 months had passed when fate quietly crossed their paths again. It was a cool Saturday afternoon in early autumn. The city's sidewalks were scattered with golden leaves, and a gentle breeze carried the comforting aroma of roasted coffee from nearby cafes. Emily had spent the morning exploring a charming independent bookstore tucked away on a quiet corner. A place filled with tall wooden shelves, soft classical music, and the comforting scent of old pages and freshly brewed espresso. She wandered through the fiction section, running her fingers lightly across the spines of familiar novels, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat. She slowly turned around. Ryan stood a few feet away, holding a book he had clearly forgotten about the moment he saw her. He looked different. There were faint circles beneath his eyes, and the confidence he once carried so effortlessly had been replaced by quiet humility. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I've imagined this conversation 100 times, he said softly. "I just never thought I'd actually get the chance." Emily offered a polite smile but remained silent. He took a slow breath. "Losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. I kept thinking love alone would fix everything. But I understand now that love without respect isn't enough. I should have defended you when it mattered most." His voice trembled with sincerity. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," he continued. "I just needed you to know that you deserved better than what I gave you." Emily looked into his eyes and, for the first time since they had met, saw a man who truly understood the consequences of his choices. The apology was genuine. It brought no anger, no satisfaction. Only a quiet sense of closure. As they stood surrounded by shelves filled with stories of second chances and new beginnings, Emily realized that forgiveness and reconciliation were not always the same thing. The decision waiting in her heart would define the woman she had become. Emily stood quietly for a moment, allowing Ryan's apology to settle between them. Around them, the bookstore remained peaceful. A customer flipped through a travel guide near the window. Soft piano music drifted through the room, and outside, amber leaves floated gently along the sidewalk as people carried warm cups of coffee through the crisp autumn air. She looked at Ryan with kind eyes, no longer clouded by the hurt that had once consumed her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I needed to hear those words, even if they came later than I hoped." Ryan nodded, lowering his gaze. "I know," he whispered. Emily took a slow breath before continuing. "When we were together, I kept believing that if I loved you enough, everything else would eventually fall into place. I thought your love would be enough to protect us." She paused, choosing her words carefully. But love without respect can never become the foundation of a lasting relationship. Ryan closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the truth he could no longer deny. "You weren't the only person in that relationship," Emily continued. "We were supposed to face life's challenges together. Instead, I felt like I was standing alone, trying to prove I deserved a place that should have already been mine." A tear slipped down Ryan's cheek. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know you are," Emily replied with a gentle smile. "And I truly hope you find happiness. But I also hope that the next person you love never has to wonder whether you'll stand beside her when it matters most." For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. There was no bitterness left. No anger. Only gratitude for the beautiful memories they had shared and acceptance that some chapters are meant to end. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag, offered one final warm smile, and turned toward the bookstore door. As the small bell chimed above her, she stepped into the cool afternoon sunlight, carrying not the weight of heartbreak, but the quiet strength of someone who had finally learned to choose herself. Ahead of her stretched a future filled with possibility, and for the first time, she walked toward it with complete peace. Several months later, life looked very different from the one Emily had once imagined. And somehow, it felt even more beautiful. On a bright spring morning, she stood in the city park with a warm cup of coffee in her hands, watching the first blossoms sway gently in the breeze. Children laughed as they chased one another across the green lawn. Joggers followed winding paths beneath blooming cherry trees, and birds filled the air with cheerful songs. The world had continued moving forward, and so had she. There had been no dramatic revenge, no desperate attempts to prove anyone wrong, and no perfect fairy tale ending. Instead, there had been quiet mornings, difficult decisions, lonely nights, and countless small moments of courage that slowly rebuilt the woman she thought she had lost. Looking back, Emily realized that the hardest step she had ever taken wasn't walking out of the apartment before sunrise. It was believing she deserved better. She smiled softly to herself. Leaving without saying goodbye wasn't about punishing someone, she reflected. It was about finally choosing the life I wanted instead of begging for one I had to earn. The gentle wind carried away the last traces of sadness that had once weighed so heavily on her heart. She had learned that love should never require someone to shrink themselves to fit another person's expectations. Real love stands beside you, protects your dignity, and makes you feel valued exactly as you are. As Emily continued walking along the flower-lined path, sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns across the ground ahead. Every step felt lighter than the one before. If her story could leave others with one lesson, it would be this. Sometimes the bravest goodbye is never spoken aloud. Sometimes, it is written in the quiet decision to walk away from what diminishes your worth and toward the future you truly deserve. And with hope in her heart and confidence in her stride, Emily embraced the new beginning that had been waiting for her all along.